For decades, the world has collectively held its breath every single time the geopolitical temperature in the Persian Gulf rises even a single degree, looming over the global economy, casting a long, dark shadow over every financial market on Earth is a terrifying phantom. They call it the Hormuz blockade. It's a scenario so catastrophic that military strategists and Wall Street analysts alike speak of it in hushed tones. And then, the hypothetical nightmare became a chilling reality. In March 2026, Iran didn't just issue another empty threat. They actually slammed the door shut on the most vital artery of the global energy supply. But they didn't just close it. They unleashed a psychological masterstroke. Tehran announced a selective opening, declaring that the strait would only be passable for the oil tankers of a few hand-picked nations. This was no longer just an embargo. This was a brazen, calculated attempt to completely redraw the map of global energy power. In the midst of this unprecedented chaos, every eye on the planet, from the frantic, shouting trading floors of London to the sprawling, neon-lit seaports of Tokyo, locked onto one singular place. Washington DXC title card cinematic sequence Act I. The superpower strikes back. The sheer audacity of the blockade forced the United States into a corner, prompting a declaration that could not have been more unyielding. Broadcasting directly from the Oval Office, President Donald Trump drew an absolute line in the sand, vowing to reopen the Strait of Hormuz at any cost. For the administration, allowing Iran to successfully blockade this global jugular wasn't just a recipe for an economic meltdown. It was a direct, humiliating slap in the face to America's status as the world's undisputed superpower. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth didn't hesitate to bring the hammer down, backing up the president's words with a promise of cold, hard steel. He guaranteed that the grey hulls of US Navy warships would soon cut through those hostile waters, ready to physically escort the world's oil tankers through the kill zone. Washington was sending an unforgiving message to the globe. America does not back down, and absolutely no one gets to strangle the arteries of free trade on their watch, but behind the roaring, patriotic rhetoric echoing out of the Pentagon, there lies a brutal, unforgiving geopolitical reality. The United States is staring down the barrel of the ultimate catch-22 on one side of the coin. Inaction is economic suicide. If the US military stands down, the price of crude oil will instantly anchor above $100 a barrel and likely rocket far higher. This would detonate an inflation bomb right in the heart of the American economy. Consumer prices would skyrocket, supply chains would fracture, and it would directly shatter the faith of American voters, people who are already profoundly sensitive to the bleeding of their own wallets at the gas pump. But flip that coin, and the alternative is equally terrifying. Sending multi-billion-dollar carrier strike groups and Arleigh-Burke-class destroyers into the suffocatingly narrow bottleneck of Hormuz is the strategic equivalent of shoving your head directly into a tiger's mouth. Act 2. The geography of a death trap. Let's visualize the terrifying geography of this choke point. At its narrowest, the Strait of Hormuz is just 21 miles wide. Think about that for a second. That is an agonizingly short distance for a massive 900-ton warship to maneuver. Now, imagine that narrow corridor flanked by hostile shores, packed with a dense, hidden arsenal of anti-ship cruise missiles and terrifying swarms of state-of-the-art unmanned aerial vehicles UAVs that Iran has methodically hoarded over decades. The strait has been transformed into a literal, inescapable kill zone. It is a place where the ultimate price for maintaining freedom of navigation could be paid in the blood of thousands of American sailors within the very first minutes of a firefight. To truly grasp why the American military brass is treading with such excruciating caution today, we have to blow the dust of the historical archives. Because what is unfolding right now in the Persian Gulf is a haunting, shot-for-shot remake of a nightmare the US Navy has already lived through. Act 3. The Ghost of the Bridgeton, 1987. The year was 1987. The brutal, grinding Iran-Iraq war was raging, and both sides were desperately trying to choke off the other's oil revenues, turning the Persian Gulf into a fiery combat zone. When Iran began aggressively targeting the oil tankers of Kuwait, a nation quietly acting as a middleman for Iraqi oil, the United States decided it was time to step in. Washington greenlit a massive operation to protect the flow of energy. They allowed Kuwaiti tankers to fly the American flag and dispatched the most sophisticated warships of the era to guard them. It was called Operation Earnest Will. The Americans arrived brimming with swagger. They possessed the ultimate high-tech fleet, fully believing that the sheer, imposing silhouette of their guided missile cruisers and destroyers would force Iran to back down. Instead, reality delivered a crushing, humiliating blow on the very first escort mission on July 24, 1987. The supertanker USS Bridgeton, a 4,140-ton Leviathan of steel, was steaming through the waters under the heavy, paranoid guard of elite US warships like the USS Kidd and the USS Fox. Suddenly, a deafening explosion ruptured the hull. The massive ship violently shuddered, throwing crew members to the deck. The weapon that crippled this behemoth wasn't a supersonic cruise missile. It wasn't a phantom submarine. It was a cheap, rusty, archaic sea mine that Iranian forces had quietly rolled off the back of a small boat in the dead of night. That single explosive moment completely shattered the Pentagon's military paradigm. Billion-dollar American warships, boasting radar systems designed to pluck Soviet bombers out of the sky from hundreds of miles away, was suddenly rendered totally helpless against invisible, low-tech assassins waiting silently on the ocean floor. The bitter irony of this situation was almost comical, because the Bridgeton was so unfathomably massive. Its compartmentalized hull could actually absorb the blast without sinking. If one of the escorting US destroyers had struck that same mine, it would have likely gone straight to the bottom of the Gulf. The resulting image was a public relations disaster. The proud, elite warships of the United States Navy were forced to line up single file, nervously tailing behind the wounded, limping oil tanker, effectively using the civilian ship as a giant, reluctant minesweeper. Military historians look back at the Bridgeton incident as a colossal propaganda victory for Tehran. Iranian state media mocked the Americans relentlessly, declaring that the multi-billion-dollar calculations of the West had been neutralized by invisible hands. That memory isn't dead. It remains a raw nerve. When a spokesman for Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Qusay RGC recently taunted the US by saying, "Remember the Bridgeton in 1987, it wasn't just empty trash talk. It was a calculated, chilling reminder of America's fatal vulnerability in these waters." Act 4. The missile cities in the Clef Sous-Bois, with a military budget that eclipses the rest of the world combined, is the US military tiptoeing around Hormuz? The answer lies in the terrifying reality of asymmetric warfare. Behind closed doors at the Pentagon, generals are staring at satellite imagery of a massive, heavily fortified fortress of firepower that Iran has spent half a century constructing. In this theater, proximity is America's deadliest enemy. Because the strait is so narrow, US warships are forced to sail directly within the point-blank crosshairs of even the most archaic coastal artillery, let alone modern precision-guided munitions. According to deeply researched reports from the Institute for the Study of War ISW, Iran has essentially terraformed its entire southern coastline and strategic islands like Keshem and Abu Musa into unsinkable aircraft carriers. Iran knows it cannot build a blue water navy to fight the US fleet head-on. They don't need to. Instead, they rely on thousands of highly mobile, meticulously camouflaged anti-ship missile launchers. Brian Clark, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a former US Navy officer, outlines a grim reality. Iran relies on lethal shoot-and-scoot tactics using devastating cruise missiles like the Nur or the Ghadir. But here is the cinematic twist that the general public rarely comprehends. The missile cities. US satellite intelligence has confirmed that Iran has literally hollowed out the limestone cliffs and mountain ranges lining the Strait of Hormuz. They have built colossal, subterranean arsenals. This means that even if the US unleashes its most terrifying strategic bombers like the B-2 Spirit or the cutting-edge B-21 radar, completely eradicating Iran's firepower from the air is a near impossible task. Iran's missile launchers are ghosts. They roll out of heavily camouflaged blasters carved into the rock, acquire their target, fire their payload, and vanish back into the heart of the mountain in under 3 minutes. For the US destroyers patrolling offshore, the jagged, mountainous terrain creates a nightmare of radar clatter. Distinguishing the radar signature of a civilian dump truck from a mobile missile launcher becomes a deadly guessing game. Studies from the Brookings Institution suggest that the success rate of missile interception drops by up to 40% in this kind of cluttered, coastal environment compared to the open ocean if Iran decides to launch a swarm attack, firing dozens of sea-skimming missiles simultaneously. Perfectly synchronized with hundreds of suicide drones, even the fabled Aegis combat system on US destroyers risks being totally overwhelmed. A $20,000 Shard drone forces the US Navy to fire an SM-2 interceptor missile that costs upwards of $2 million. IT is a grinding, agonizing war of economic attrition. And in a battle of pure math, the United States is always bleeding money. Act B. The 6-point playbook depicts the lock make no mistake, despite the terrifying traps laid out in the Gulf. The United States is not going to sit quietly and let the global economy be held hostage. Based on declassified briefs and analysis from the Congressional Research Service CRS, the Pentagon has a 6-point playbook to forcefully pry the strait open. Number 1. Establish total air supremacy. The US won't blindly rush ships into the bottleneck. They will park the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group safely over the horizon in the Arabian Sea. From there, they will launch endless waves of F-35 Lightning IIS and F-18 Super Hornets, creating an impenetrable dome of radar and firepower. Over the strait, anything that moves on the Iranian coast gets painted by radar and obliterated before it can lock onto a tanker. Number 2. Send in the robots to counter the terrifying threat of sea mines. The US will deploy advanced littoral combat ships LCS instead of risking human divers. They will unleash fleets of unmanned underwater vehicles UUVs, essentially high-tech robotic bloodhounds, to meticulously scan the ocean floor and neutralize explosives before the convoys arrive. Number 3. Heavily armed convoy escorts, reverting to the classic naval tactics of World War II. The US will bunch the massive oil tankers together and flank them with Arleigh Burke destroyers. It's the ultimate bodyguard detail. If a single shot is fired from the Iranian coast, the escorting warships are authorized to unleash a disproportionate, devastating wall of retaliatory fire. Number 4. Kinetic decapitation. If Iran refuses to back down, the US will transition to an offensive footing. This means launching a ferocious barrage of Tomahawk land attack missile slams aimed squarely at Iran's coastal radar installations, command bunkers, and known missile silos. The goal is to blind the enemy and pull their teeth before the convoys even cross the threshold. Number 5. Build a global coalition. President Trump knows the political and financial cost of going it alone. Washington is aggressively leaning on the UK, France, Japan, and South Korea to deploy their own frigates and destroyers to the region. By internationalizing the conflict under the banner of a maritime coalition, the diplomatic and military pressure on Tehran becomes utterly crushing. Number 6. unleash electronic witchcraft. Before a single bullet is fired, US Cyber Command will go to war using advanced electronic warfare aircraft like the Air-18G Growler. The US will flood Iranian radar screens with static and false ghosts. Simultaneously, military hackers will attempt to brick Iran's launch systems remotely. The missiles might be sitting on the launch pad, but their digital brains will be scrambled into useless scrap metal. Act B. The bleeding of the superpower. With these 6 overwhelming strategies, military experts agree that US could absolutely force the Strait open. So, why the hesitation? Why the agonizingly slow build-up? Because the price tag of this operation is staggering. The greatest fear in Washington isn't the explosive yield of an Iranian missile. It's the numbers ticking up on the price boards of gas stations from Texas to California. In America, politics is tethered to the wallet. When oil crosses $100 a barrel, the domino effect is ruthless. Freight costs surge, grocery bills explode, and consumer confidence free falls. Goldman Sachs research indicates that for every 10-cent hike at the pump, billions of dollars of purchasing power are wiped out from the US economy. But let's look at the military ledger. Escorting ships sounds simple on paper. In reality, it is a logistical nightmare. To safely move a convoy of 5 to 10 tankers through the kill zone, the US might need up to 12 escorting warships to provide 360-degree protection against submarines, speedboats, and aerial swarms. Furthermore, they need a constant 24/7 rotation of MQ-9 Reaper drones loitering above the strait, acting as the eyes in the sky to hunt for pop-up missile launchers. Do you know how much it costs to operate a single carrier strike group? According to the Congressional Budget Office (CBO), it burns through roughly $6.5 million every single day. And that's before they fire a single weapon. A 6-month escort campaign would incinerate over $1.2 billion in direct operational costs alone. Worse yet, this forces the US Navy to pull vital assets away from the South China Sea, where they are meant to contain China, and the Atlantic, where they track Russian submarines. The US military is being stretched to the snapping point, pulled into a strategic quagmire where every day they win tactically, they lose strategically by draining their treasury. Act 7. The amphibious nightmare when the naval escort options begin to look too costly. The Pentagon is forced to review the darkest scenario in their playbook, an amphibious ground invasion. If the US Navy cannot defend the ships from the shore, the only permanent solution is to physically capture the shore. This transforms a naval standoff into a massive, bloody infantry war. Imagine the sheer scale of it. The deployment of Marine expeditionary units use thousands of Marines, amphibious assault vehicles, and attack helicopters storming the jagged, inhospitable beaches of southern Iran to carve out a massive buffer zone. But Iran is not the flat deserts of Iraq. The terrain is a hellish maze of mountains. An invasion force would immediately clash with the IRGC, a fanatically loyal force of 190,000 men who are absolute masters of guerrilla warfare. The Marines would be fighting a terrifying game of cat and mouse. When US air support arrives, Iranian fighters vanish deep into the caves. When the jets bingo their fuel and leave, the fighters emerge with shoulder-fired rockets and suicide drones. Putting American boots on Iranian soil crosses the point of no return. It triggers a regional war. Every US base in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE instantly becomes a target for Iran's massive stockpile of ballistic missiles. To secure the strait from the land, the US would have to occupy the territory for years. The cost in American blood, trillions of taxpayer dollars, and absolute political ruin at home makes this the ultimate poison pill. Act 8. The myth of the pipeline bypass money. Armchair generals ask, why not just bypass Hormuz completely? Pump the oil through pipelines across Saudi Arabia. The reality is incredibly unforgiving. Yes, Saudi Arabia has the East-West pipeline, but its absolute maximum capacity is roughly 5 million barrels a day. The Strait of Hormuz handles over 20 million barrels daily. Even if every pipeline in the region was running at 110%, the global market would still instantly face a catastrophic shortfall of 15 million barrels every single day. Furthermore, pipelines are not magic bulletproof tubes. They are thousands of miles of exposed, stationary steel cutting through open deserts. The Houthi rebels in Yemen have repeatedly proven that they can launch long-range drones and precision strike these exact pumping stations. If defending a moving ship is hard, defending a 100-mile static pipeline is practically impossible. There is no plan B. The global reliance on Hormuz is a geographical shackle that even the United States cannot simply snap. Act 9. The insurance guillotine and the fall of the petrodollar. Ultimately, we have to face the harshest truth of all. Military hardware doesn't control the ocean. The insurance underwriters in London do. The US Navy can vaporize an incoming missile with a laser-guided interceptor, but they are powerless against a spreadsheet at Lloyd's of London. The moment the Strait of Hormuz is officially declared a war zone, maritime insurance premiums mutate. What used to cost tens of thousands of dollars to insure a voyage suddenly costs millions for a Greek or Norwegian shipping magnate. It doesn't matter if you have a US destroyer glued to your hull. The mere statistical risk of a stray $100 sea mine blowing a hole in your $100 million tanker is enough to wipe out the profit margins of an entire fleet when the premiums hit the ceiling. The ship owners don't call the Pentagon. They call their captains and order them to drop anchor. The ships simply stop sailing. This is Iran's ultimate trump card. They don't actually have to sink an American aircraft carrier. They just have to make the cost of doing business so terrifyingly high that capitalism surrenders. And standing in the shadows, quietly taking notes, is the true global rival. China, Beijing, is the single largest consumer of oil flowing out of Hormuz. Iran's sinister offer of a selective opening is bait designed specifically to lure China into the region as a primary power broker. It forces Washington into a devastating binary choice. Either bear the astronomical financial and military burden of policing the world's oceans completely alone, or step aside and allow rival powers to dictate the flow of global energy. If the United States fails to decisively crush this blockade, it marks the definitive end of Pax Americana. For nearly a century, the US Navy has been the sole, unquestioned guarantor of global maritime security. That security is the very foundation of the petrodollar, the system where the world's oil is traded exclusively in US currency, granting Washington unparalleled financial supremacy if the world loses faith in America's ability to keep the straits open. Nations will immediately seek alternative security pacts and begin trading energy in other currencies. This isn't just about gas prices going up in Ohio. This is about the total unspooling of American financial dominance. Outro. The brink of a new wraith saga of the Strait of Hormuz is not simply a contest of who has the bigger missiles or the stealthiest jets. It is a profound, terrifying testament to the fragility of our interconnected world. It proves that in the 21st century, a tiny, 21-mile geographic bottleneck can totally paralyze the greatest military empire in human history. The United States is standing at a historic, treacherous crossroads. They must either embrace a full-scale, devastating military confrontation with costs that cannot be measured, or swallow their pride and seek a labyrinthine diplomatic compromise to soothe the bruised ego of a hostile nation. Are we watching the final twilight of the old American-led world order? Are we witnessing the dawn of an era where regional powers can leverage sheer geography to bring high-tech superpowers to their knees? The definitive answer will be written on the deep, dark blue waters of the Persian Gulf in the months to come. But one thing is absolutely certain: as long as crude oil remains the lifeblood of human civilization, Hormuz will remain the geopolitical tripwire where one microscopic miscalculation could force the entire globe to pay the ultimate price. Closing. Visuals fade to black as the sound of a heartbeat monitor blends into the sonar ping of a submarine. Thanks for diving into this with us. If this deep dive geopolitical analysis brought value to you, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss our next breakdown of the world's most dangerous flashpoints. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next one.